Yeah, neener
It's like
neener
that.
pumpkin eater. Ha ha ha
So,
ha. Neener neener neener.
meaner. Okay, we got to edit that out of the recording.
Oh wait, you're not gonna put that? That'd probably get us the most hits. All
Okay,
right, we ready?
I'm ready.
You sure?
Yep,
Okay.
totally. Hey friends, I am at my studio today working on some class samples for some upcoming live workshops, which I'm very excited about. And while I have been working on these class samples, I have been reflecting a lot on a conversation I had recently with my friend Michael DeMeng. This conversation was all about the stories that we read as children, those books that just like stuck with us, those fairy tales that really had an impact on us. And now, as adults, how those stories or those symbols in those stories or the lessons that we learned in those stories influence us and especially influence our creative process and the art that we create. It was such a fun conversation. I always love chatting with Michael. He always has such great insight on creativity and art and the creative process. I hope that you can just settle in, enjoy this conversation, maybe get your sketchbook out, do some doodling while you're listening. Just hope this conversation is enriching for you and maybe gives you some encouragement to bring some of those good stories from your childhood into your creative process today. So, take a listen.
Hi, everybody, this is Michael DeMeng here, and I'm with my buddy Stephanie Lee, who I often chat with about this, that, or the other thing, usually arty things. And today, Stephanie, what are we going to chat about?
We are going to be talking about the stories that we're still in, specifically with regards to children's stories, fairy tales, some of those classic books that we all loved as kids, and how they still affect us to this day and how they influence our art as well into adulthood.
So basically, things that, but like both of us have books that we read as kids, and in some cases, some of the books that I have on my list, I read as an adult and wished I had
Mm-hmm.
read as a kid. And the idea is that even though they're designed for kids, I found a lot of these books, especially stuff that I read as kids, still affect me as an adult. I mean, it's hauntingly so. I find. I mean, don't you
Yeah,
agree, Steph?
absolutely. Yeah, and then the stories that a lot of the stories that I liked as a kid, I have come to appreciate as an adult. Like there's things that revisiting them as an adult, it's like, wow, I didn't catch that symbolism when I was a kid. I just thought it was a cool story, or I didn't understand the breadth, the width of it, or the depth of it when I was a kid. I just liked it as a good story.
Well, and
But
that's a sign of I think, a good book. I mean, even
yeah,
you see it even in Disney cartoons, these days especially, where you have like elements that are obviously, or Pixar really is probably a better example of it, where
yep,
things are obviously designed for the adults, probably so they don't get bored. It's like
yeah,
reading a kid's book. It's like, okay, well, I'm going to get bored
yeah,
reading this really quick if I have to read this little caterpillar one more time or whatever it is.
yeah.
So yeah, I think
Well, I
that's
remember when my kids were little, my girls were little, they're well into their 20s now. And I noticed at the time when we would take them to movies that were like animated, kids cartoons. I remember thinking they're making these movies more and more for adults. And I just assumed like there were adult little jokes or symbolism or something in them, not like bad adult, but just things that the adults would be entertained by. And I remember thinking, oh, that's probably just so they can sell movie tickets, because what adult's going to want to take their kid to a kids movie if it's not entertaining for them too? And though there may be some truth to that, I've changed my opinion about that in that, like Moana, for example, it's one of my absolute favorite kids cartoons. My youngest granddaughter, who's now 8, she at like 1 years old was glued to that movie, and I just assumed it was the music and the whatever. But because she was glued to it so often, I saw the movie a lot, just in babysitting or whatever. And I'm like, oh, this isn't just a movie they made to like entertain adults. There's actually some really significant story and symbolism and stuff going on with this. So my opinion has changed from oh, they're just trying to sell tickets
yeah.
to, oh, a good story appeals to all ages and different levels.
Now,
So
well, and I think that I mean I think that's and obviously what we're not talking about is see spot run type of stuff. I mean
right, right, right.
that's a different. I mean, I don't think anybody here is like, well, as an adult, that see spot run and the Dick and Jane books really
Dick and Jane really had an
they really
impact.
molded me as a human. But I
Yeah.
mean, I was trying to think back to probably the first book I remember. Now, once again, I mean, I don't really remember. I know that there probably were the little color books and fuzzy books. I don't really
Hmm.
remember
Yeah.
those, but I do remember it was one of two books was my first book that I recall anyway. And it's either it's either Where the Wild Things Are,
Oh yeah, that's a
Maurice
good
Sendak,
one.
right?
Mhm.
Or it's A Nightmare in My Closet, which I'm
Mm.
trying to remember. I think I have it written down who the author was. Oh, Mercer Mayer
Oh
wrote it.
yeah, same guy. Isn't
No,
that the same guy that
Maurice
wrote
Sendak.
Wild Things
Maurice
Are?
Sendak
Oh,
was
that's right. That's right.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Similar. Gotcha.
Same sort of sounding names. I don't
Mm-hmm.
think they're related
Mm-hmm.
though. It's one of those two. They're both kind of similar books. They also kind
Mm-hmm.
of the drawings actually look really similar. Are you familiar with A Nightmare
Yeah.
in My Closet or Nightmare in My Closet?
No, I'm not familiar with that, but Mercer Mayer's illustrations I'm familiar with, and they definitely have a similar sort of kind of sketchy, childlike, monstery vibe,
Yeah, totally.
don't
And it
they?
has
Yeah.
that, it has that sort of same bluish,
Yeah.
nighttimey sort of quality, right?
Mm-hmm.
But
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
but yeah, it was one of those two things. And it's funny because when I look back to whatever one of those. So just for those who, I mean, Nightmare, okay, the Nightmare in My Closet, the basic premise is little kid's afraid. He's hiding under the bed covers because there's a nightmare in the closet, and he gets the courage to go and battle it. And it's like literally one sentence per page type of book.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then he's got his little pop gun, and then there's a monster. And then basically at the end, the monster becomes a friend. Not to spoil it for anyone.
Right. Oh,
And of
dang it.
course, Where the Wild Things Are, the kid gets sent to dinner without dinner, or get sent to bed without dinner, and then in his imagination he goes off to where the wild things are, and most people know the story. Now, as I were to think back, as I think back on that, it's funny because I'm sort of like, um, as an artist, as an adult, I think in some ways it sort of fed the whole creative thing. Maybe the nightmare one more so because I started leaning into the creepy weirdo things that I did, and that's the same thing true with Where the
Mm-hmm.
Wild Things Are, of course. But Wild
Mm-hmm.
Things is really more of a creativity book. It's like
Yeah.
it's like when you're
Adventure. Yeah.
right, and so that also I think fed into me as an artist later. What was your first book that you remember anyway?
Yeah. Well, it's funny because I really had to rack my brain. It's ironically, it's a Dick and Jane book, and it didn't impact me for the storyline. Couldn't tell you what the storyline was. I'm sure there was a dog and a swing set, the classic Dick and Jane stuff. But what impacted me about that was I learned how to read before I went to school. My mom was really into that kind of stuff. And so I remember riding a bus across the country. We were going to visit my mom's parents at the time, and I learned how to read on this bus. And so, though the storyline of Dick and Jane necessarily wasn't, like I said, I don't even remember. Was there even really
Well, they're
much of a
pretty
story?
they're pretty
You know,
similar. It's like,
it's
oh,
pretty.
see Dick swing. Yay. Okay.
Yep, yep, yep.
Yeah.
But it was the fact that there was this world available to me if I knew how to read. That to me was like such a big deal. And so there
Right,
were a
right.
lot of I was devouring chapter books earlier. Like there's a book called Caddy Woodlawn. That's the earliest one I remember reading, and it was a chapter book. So I felt so grown up. But I want to say I was in like second grade when I was reading it. So I it was kind of a Little House on the Prairie vibe, except within the first couple of chapters, you learn that Caddy, the girl, the little pioneer girl, had lost her mother. Her mother had spilled like gasoline on herself and had burned to death. And so it was this tragic,
Right, right.
story. And this girl she didn't have a lot. I mean, it was, if you think about maybe the era or something, she didn't have people like really tending to her emotional needs. It was like, well, it's time, your mom's dead, the funeral's over, it's time to go milk the cow, kind of a,
Wow,
kind of a,
that's pretty dark. Now, granted, I mean, a lot of kid stories are dark, especially like sort of as they get, not so much the little Dick and Jane ones, but as you get older,
right.
there's a darkness. Certainly, fairy tales have precedent to that, but
Yeah. Well, and also we could call it dark or we could call it real. I
right,
mean,
right,
real life
right,
has,
right.
I mean, little girls lose their moms, right? Like kind of a thing. And so the impact of that book was huge on me because this girl was plucky. She was, um, she had her feelings about it, but she figured out how to survive in a world that wasn't very soft, to her.
Yeah,
And so that really impacted me. So, it was technically not a children's book, but I read it as a child,
sure,
and then my
sure.
my parents read to me a lot. There was a a book my dad read to me called The Kingfishers, and I it was literally the story of this little bird couple, the kingfisher couple, and how they survived and built nests and all this. And I think it was probably along the lines of like The Greatest Salesman in the World kind of books. Like it was
Sure,
a
sure.
story, an allegory of some sort. I don't remember a lot of how that went down, but I just remember these birds, their commitment to survival, and how delicate they were, and how the wind would just toss them around, and they would have to like cling with their little bird claws to a branch until the storm passed. I'm wondering if I was like, as I'm sitting here talking now, it's like, did I have a propensity towards tragedy even then? Like, ooh, this is
Well, I mean,
survival.
I do think kids are pretty fascinated by tragedy because
Hmm.
there's a lot of stuff that, death is kind of this big question mark. Not that it gets any better as you get older, but
Yeah,
death's a big
yeah,
question mark, right? So, it's probably one of the more bewildering things I think as a child. And and obviously I think like when you're talking about like, having the book with, the mother dying from, being burned by gasoline or whatever, you know, originally, fairy tales are designed to be sort of, well, you keep your children safe, right?
right.
So for instance, the Hansel and Gretel, well, you better not go out into the
Right.
woods or there'll be an evil witch who eats you up. And they all
Yep.
end bad. And really the reason they
Yeah.
end bad is because people didn't do what they're supposed to do, you know.
Yeah.
And granted, earlier versions of them were maybe a little less so, but to some degree, it's sort of like they're allegories for something, whatever
Yeah.
that is, right? They're
Yeah.
sort of like lessons to be learned. And I'm sure
Yeah.
the book that you're talking about is the same thing. There's a lesson to be learned, obviously, okay, how to deal with hardship, and doesn't have witches and ogres in it, but it's still the same sort of concept. And I do think that is
Yeah.
something that is pretty consistent with children books in general, in that really there's a lesson, whereas adult fiction is not really about a lesson. It can be, but it's more of like it can also be just a study of something,
Hmm.
a fascination of something.
Yeah.
And I
Well,
think
and
that
and uh, sorry, go ahead.
no, go.
I was just going to say that one of the things that I think, as I reflect on what I was drawn to as a kid, there were stories where there was a bad guy, and there were stories where life was the bad guy.
Right,
There
right.
there wasn't an actual like villain or bad guy in Caddy Woodlawn that I remember. There wasn't a bad guy in Kingfishers, but the weather or the circumstances or whatever, life was the thing that they were having to protect themselves again, or be careful from, or overcome. And there's a book, I don't know if you would like it. It's one of my absolute favorite books. It was written in the I want to say like early 60s, about this woman's time living up in Port Townsend area. Up There's a road called the Agonai Road, and the book is called the Agonai. If you haven't read it, it's a really
Oh yeah, yeah,
entertaining
yeah.
book. It's a
I don't
memoir.
know that I read it, but I'm familiar with it. Yeah.
It's absolutely one of my favorite books, and it's kind of the same thing. She was it's memoir. She was a chicken farmer's wife, and the whole book, she's got really great comedy in it, like this kind of dry comedy. But the whole book is basically her like pissed off about having to live this life as a chicken farmer. She's from a wealthy family in San Francisco, and then she falls in love with this guy, and all he wants to be is a chicken farmer. And she's like, I didn't know if you married a guy that wanted to be a chicken farmer that I was going to become a chicken farmer, like it. But it's all like the weather and the wetness, and her stupid wood stove doesn't ever heat the house up enough, and it's like all of the challenges. The whole There's a whole spin-off that was, I think, a TV series called Mom and Pa Kettle.
Oh,
I don't know if
okay.
you've ever
Yeah.
heard of that. So
Well,
those
Mom and
were
Pa
her
Kettle were
neighbors.
Mom, that was like an old like I think it was a radio show for a while, but also I think it was
Yeah,
a series of movies way back when too.
yeah. There's some connection there where like those were real people in her book, and then they became these fictional
Yeah. Yeah.
spin-off characters or something. But that's the same kind of book. It's like those books where life is this big challenge that really appeals to me, and to see, and it's not even necessarily that people always overcome them. You know, Caddy
Yeah.
Woodlawn didn't
Yeah.
overcome her mother's death and then her mother was suddenly alive. It's like they figure out how to exist, how to still find things they love. You know, they like sometimes that's
Well,
the best
it's
it
sort of
is.
like it's like something like Charlotte's Web, right? Now
Yeah,
granted, I always leaned more heavily into the fantastical, but
yeah, yeah,
Charlotte's Web, also it's about tragedy and loss and overcoming and sometimes there are things you don't overcome. I mean,
yep,
you overcome getting slaughtered by the farmer with the
yeah.
help of a friend and friends but you lose your
But the friend
friends.
might die.
Right,
Yep,
exactly.
exactly.
And that's just what it is.
Yeah,
It's a comforting way to ease, people or to ease children into things, I think in some cases. Now, I remember
yeah.
you were talking about you're talking about what your parents read you. I was trying to remember what my parents read me. And I
Mm,
don't remember them reading to me very often. I'm sure they did, but I just don't remember it.
mm-hmm.
And I do remember my dad when I must have been probably about, I don't know, 6 or 7 was reading me. I don't think it lasted long, but he was reading to me from Dracula. Um,
Oh, of
and I
course.
haven't etched in my brain. I have, I remember the carriage ride, the, Jonathan Harker riding up the pass and that wolves
Mm-hmm.
howling and
Mm-hmm.
so it's like locked in my brain.
Yeah.
Like one of the few things that I remember. My grandmother did read to me, but she actually did
Mm-hmm.
more. She used to tell me more dirty jokes
Oh, leave it
than
to
she did.
grandmas.
Right. It's sort of like I remember the one about the two little pigs making bubbles in the, making bubbles in the pig pen and somebody was really offended and called the cops and then of course it ends with out of the mud comes this little pig says what's wrong with making bubbles in
Uh,
the mud? I'm Bubbles, right?
yeah.
It's right. It's like which was
And then the kid be
scandalous when
like,
you're a
haha.
child. Oh my
Yeah,
gosh, you're right.
totally,
Yeah.
totally.
Now my first
You
I
really
will say
wanted to
that
tell
one
it
of
to
my
people.
not related to morality though, one of my favorite
Mm-hmm.
books was a book called The Ice Cream Cone Coot and Other Birds.
Mm.
And this was awesome book. Okay, this was like one of
Never heard
those
of it.
picture books. Well, okay, so you've
Yeah.
never heard of it. Okay,
I'm
well,
writing it down.
okay, okay, it's out of print unfortunately, but it's The Ice Cream
Oh
Cone
no.
Coot and Other Rare Birds by Arnold Lobel. And so each
Uh-huh.
one, and this explains a lot in terms of me artistically, if you think about it, when you'll understand in a minute. So there'd be images of birds, like on the cover was this sort of stork-like bird, big long legs,
Mm-hmm.
and it had a big long beak, but the beak was an ice cream cone, and then the
Mm.
head was like, the ice cream, right? And so all the birds were these weird kind of object related birds. So for instance, let's see, they would accompany a poem. So the
Mm-hmm.
ice cream cone coot. Okay, so there'd be a picture of that bird. So it was kind of an Audubon Society type of thing.
Yeah.
So the
Yeah.
ice cream cone coot is a bird of great renown, with feathers soft as frosting, and a cone upon his crown. Okay, so and then there's the drippet, and the drippet was cool because it had like a faucet beak and a little, spigot.
Ah.
And the drippet is a bird who drips from, okay, the drippet is a bird who drips from beak to tail. What? That doesn't make any sense. The drippet.
You loved it as a kid though.
Well, that one doesn't make any sense. I think there was a misprint on that one. Okay, so
Gotcha.
I'll give you another one. The shuttercluck. Here we go. The shuttercluck flaps with a clatter. His wings go slam. His feet go patter. Oh, this one's pretty good. The milk bottle midge. The milk bottle midge is a bird highly prized. He is friendly and round and homogenized. So, of course, meat in the bottle.
Yeah, his bottle of milk.
So I was
That's
thinking because
very
there's also the
reflective of your assemblages.
jackknife Niffy, he has scissor
Hmm. Hmm.
beaks and he chops off your nose in a jiffy or, anyway.
Oh,
So,
awful.
yeah, so but that I was thinking about that and I was thinking like, you know what? I think about what I do and that's kind of related, right?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, so now the question to you is, Do you feel about how do you feel about how does your literature, if you can think of anything directly, is there anything directly that you can think of that you could say, you know what, I can pinpoint something that still, that still relates. Like for instance, what I was just referencing you now is a recent rediscovery where I go, you know what, I can totally see why I'm into the things I'm into now, based on how fascinated by that thing that I used to read over and over and over and over again. So for you,
Yeah.
what do you think? Do you have any?
Yeah, yeah. Well, the first thing that comes to mind is maybe a little too obvious. Is like I was always I besides Caddy Woodlawn, I loved Little House on the Prairie, and it kind of cracks me up. Like there's this whole movement of women who are my age who are like suddenly realizing that apparently Hot Ingalls was hot. I've never thought of him as hot, but you know, just like I think they're the same women who think that Steve Irwin's son is hot too. Like that's this whole movement online right now. Anyway, but I really loved, and here's the question. This is a chicken and the egg question. Like which came first? Did I love those books because I was already inclined towards this, or did those books foster this inclination? But I love like the simple old fashioned life, right? Like sitting around a fire with my family, or even in my art, I love using those old Dust Bowl images. And I will say that like probably even besides this, and this isn't children's book, so I guess take that for what it's worth. Besides the Little House on the Prairie and the Caddy Woodlawn kind of pioneer way of life, where like I have my own chickens and I garden and I do all that kind of stuff, John Steinbeck's work, once I got into middle school and high school, I was profoundly moved for some reason by Cannery Row and Grapes of Wrath. And again, one of those situations where there isn't necessarily a bad guy, but it's just life is just really, really
Yeah,
rough.
yeah, yeah.
And my absolute favorite, probably my favorite John Steinbeck book is Travels with Charlie, which I think is his only memoir. I'm not sure if it's his only one, but it is a memoir about his cross country road trip from the East Coast to the West Coast. Um, by then, he knew he was dying, I believe, of cancer, but I don't know that his people knew. So he's making this road trip, and it's like this whole story of his journey across the country, and going to diners, and everything was covered in vinyl. And he's like, I've had food that tasted better from men who never washed their hands in other countries, so he's like lamenting the modernization of the world.
Right.
And just that sort of like Grapes of Wrath, Tannery Row, Dust Bowl era has always fascinated me. And I have, to this day, I'm looking over at like files this thick of photographs that I've collected over the years that are very much that era, that like Dust Bowl, pioneer into Dust Bowl era,
Well, and
that
that
I
that
love
really
using in
does
my
get that
art.
feeds into, yeah, exactly. That totally feeds into
Yeah.
your art because a lot of it
Yeah.
is not necessarily, it has a landscape-esque quality. Like
Mm-hmm.
there's that, even when they're not landscapes, there's a vastness to
Mm-hmm.
a lot of the stuff you do. There's um a nostalgic vastness, I think would be the way I would put it. There's a layer of dust on everything. And I mean
Mm-hmm.
that
Mm-hmm.
metaphorically, of course.
Mm-hmm.
Everything
Mm-hmm.
seems aged and antiqued and not pure, uh,
Mm-hmm.
but it's but it does have this. There's a sense of nostalgia in the work you do. Even like the simple layer of plaster that you add
Mm-hmm.
simple designs to has, I think, a very similar aspect to it. So
Well, thank you. I consider that a compliment because that's what I'm striving for. I think the challenge that I have is when I get those images, a lot of the times the images that appeal to me the most are the ones that are the lower quality.
mhm.
Like this the camera was overexposed or something. Like I
Right, right.
because a lot of people will use, quote unquote vintage images in their work, and in all sorts of different ways. And I'm always struggling with trying to capture that sort of nostalgic, like I'm just imagining like when you're just outside and all you hear is the air. It's like, how does air have a sound,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
it's not. But but without making it cute,
Yeah.
and I say
Yeah.
cute, I have my own definition of cute, and there's always tension there for me because, how do I tweak this? Sometimes it means, doing weird proportion stuff, and every single time I'm like, I don't know if I got this right, but this feels like the next move, in this piece to capture that feeling. But that vastness, that kind of, um I don't know that stoic is the word, austere isn't quite the word either, but it's one of the things I love about Edward Hopper's work is it feels like that, coming out of the Dust Bowl era feeling of like, okay, we've survived everything that tried to take us out, and
Well, there's
we're
also
just gonna.
I also the other thing that even though it's a little more I would say artistically, even though it's a little more um I don't know, romanticized, I suppose, but sort of the Wyeth work.
Yeah,
There's
yeah,
that,
absolutely,
you
Edgar
know,
White, yeah,
um,
yeah,
and so it has, and once again, it's that sort of Midwesty sort of vastness. Now, I mean, I think that's, I mean, that you're, his stuff is a little more beauteous, I think,
yeah, yeah,
whereas, yours, is definitely, as I said, dustier. There's a dustierness
yeah, yeah.
to it. So,
Well, and I remember first being exposed to Remington's work in
mhm.
in middle school, learning about Remington's work, and it blew my mind how photographic his work seemed to me at the
Oh yeah, I
time.
mean, you had to
And
be. I mean, that was the whole
it
point.
had
I
to be.
mean, right?
Yeah.
That was the whole point. So, I mean,
Yeah. And a lot of his work was, desert themed, the cowboys in the desert. And of course I grew up in the West, so I've really resonated with that. But I've never I've never been drawn to realism to that extent. So it even kind of surprises me, like, why do I like I don't think I would ever have a Remington print. Like don't think I would ever buy it, but I was just so fascinated by like, you'd even see like snot dripping from a bucking bronco's nose. Like it was so
yeah, yeah.
involved. And I think kind of going back to like why stuff stuck with me and why stuff didn't stick with me. I remember watching shows or reading books like Cinderella and Snow White, like the classic fairy tales, and I would get so frustrated with these dumb girls, like, why are you, or Goldilocks, I just thought they were being so dumb. you know and it wasn't like a you know, I don't even know how to describe it, but I would get frustrated with Snow White, for example. Like, why is she putting up with this crap? Why doesn't Cinderella throat punch those stupid
Well, I mean,
stepsisters,
right.
you
Well,
know?
and the thing is, I mean, and part of that, I mean, to answer your question, of course, is I mean, it is because of the era. In fact,
Yeah,
I mean,
totally.
if you were to look at the old Sleeping Beauty, that's a friggin' grim tale. I mean, she's actually raped while she's asleep in that. I mean, it's horrific. I
It's
mean,
horrible.
and I mean, so I mean, that is in essence that's in essence, a statement about, what the roles were. And that was certainly true in Disney in the, 30s and whatever, early
Yeah.
Snow White, and things started to change, later, but, not, it's still the happy housewife kind of idea is
Yeah,
what it amounted to.
exactly.
Be
Yeah.
happy in your lot, right? So,
And until you can be rescued,
mhm.
by
Right,
not just a man, but like something outside of you, whether it's a
right.
man or time or a kiss, whatever, be rescued by something outside of you. And it's interesting to me because I don't consider myself, when I look back on my history, just my own self-judgment, I don't consider myself as this like, um plucky self. I don't think I would have throat punched my stepsisters if I was Cinderella. I would
Right.
have been
Well,
just like, can I get
Well,
out of
but I
here?
mean, and I think that's part of the problem is I think that in some ways these are supposed to be stories that sort of help guide your way. Now, I will say this, okay? So I don't know how familiar you are with some of the Baba Yaga tales. Okay, so
Little bit.
so Baba Yaga being the evil crone, well, not always evil, but the crone in the woods lives in the house with the chicken foot. It has chicken foot, one chicken foot it sits on
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
bounces around. And
Mhm.
predominantly Slavic Russian fairy tales.
Mhm.
And she's kind of ambivalent to the world. She's really more in tune with nature. She's ambivalent to
Mhm.
humanity. I shouldn't say the world,
Mhm.
humanity. She's kind of
Hmm.
like whatever, skulls on her, fence posts.
Yeah.
And
And she's tucked in the dark woods, isn't
right, yeah,
she?
way,
Yeah. Yeah.
the place
Deep.
where all really good fairy tales start, deep, deep,
Yeah.
dark in the forest, right?
Smelled like moss and dirt.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And
Yeah.
so Vasilisa, I think is the name, if I
Hmm.
remember correctly, but she's imprisoned, and then of course she has to find her way out of
Hmm.
as her servant out of
Right.
Baba Yaga's house. And so I think that's an example of a female protagonist who is able to escape the clutches of the, and of course there are some, but really where they seem to really be lacking is really sort of in the early part of the 1900s. Like you go
Hmm.
back and you actually see, in some cases, more female protagonists, being sturdier than you do,
Yeah.
the era,
Yeah.
especially in the United States, where it's like, no, okay, put on your apron and let me fix this for you, type of thing.
Yeah. And I'm certain, without having studied it myself, I'm certain there are some pretty obvious, if you were to look at what was going on in just like world culture or even Western culture or something at that time, and be like, oh, that's why. That was the message that was
Yeah.
trying to be resold. We're trying to sell a different message, to people. And so it makes sense. Not It makes sense considering what the world was doing. And I don't know if you've ever listened to any of Clarissa Pinkola Estée's books. Have you? I mean,
Mm, mm,
I think she writes them more for women, but I think you would really like them. Like there's a story, the one that she's most famous for having written is called Women Who Run with the Wolves.
mm,
And I want to say I don't know what her heritage is. I don't know if she's Mexican or Guatemalan or some Latin American country, but she's a phenomenal storyteller. And she will incorporate so many of these things like Baba Yaga and so many of these lore, the darker fairy tales, any of that, but she does it in this context of like, look how this is relevant to the woman who exists today or the person who exists today. And even for even though I think that she wrote it thinking of women reading it, for I think it would be powerful for men to read it too, because there's this whole inner world of women, um within the fairy tales that she's sharing, that I think is why it's so common to hear these stupid generalizations that, like, locker room type
yeah.
talk is like,
Yeah.
oh yeah, my wife, she's such a nag. It's like, well, wait a minute, listen to the story about this and maybe you'll understand why she feels like she's losing your mind trying to get any support. Or,
Right.
like,
Right. Right.
anyway, really, really fascinating stuff. And she tells a version of the Baba Yaga story, that made me just like, oh, I feel bad for Baba Yaga. She needs,
Yeah. No, I mean,
you know,
yeah, I mean, oh, I know. I mean, it
she didn't just get that
depending on
way in
how you
a,
read it, I
yeah,
mean,
yeah.
no, so what's interesting is like when you look at like some of the old tales, like for instance, okay, so I think it was in the Victorian era, that's sort of
Mm-hmm.
when Mother Goose sort of popped up, to sort of temper some of
Mm,
as did fairy tales, unquote, to temper some of the
mm-hmm.
darker stuff that was coming before from the Grimms, the Brothers Grimm, right? So
Yeah,
you
yeah,
got
yeah.
because their stuff was like, oh,
It
geez,
was grim.
right? It was all
They
it all ended
they are
bad.
now their own like adjective,
Right.
grim.
Exactly.
Yeah,
I mean, they're just, it just does. I mean, it just where, I mean, it's like you read it, oh, here's another bad one. But
yeah.
but so there's like, okay, we need to temper this. And so then Mother Goose pops up and fairy tales, unquote, fairy tales kind of pops up in the 1800s too, which, are lighter and, also.
Mm-hmm.
But, it's interesting because, well, even like, what's interesting is how these are used though. So like you were talking about like Moana, right?
Mm-hmm.
Having elements that address stuff as an adult, and in how like certainly a lot of the stories you're reading are
Yeah,
adult things, and I think that's true with a lot of kids book, and in some ways they're secretly adult. um
yeah, exactly.
so I mean, okay, so a really good example, and so politically, so Wizard of Oz is a great example because Wizard of
Mm-hmm.
Oz is if you break it down, it's actually politics. I mean, it's
Mm,
actually each character is sort of symbolic, sort of like
hmm
even though like Animal Farm is a kid's
hmm
book, but not really a kid's book.
It was one of my
It's
favorites.
the same kind of thing. But
Yeah.
it's funny because there's hints of things that are really dark in all those things.
hmm
Even though they
hmm
can be read lighter on one level. Like, well, I
Yeah.
mean, though I will say there is this there in I think it's the Tin Man of Oz, one of the books that follows.
hmm
The backstory of the
hmm
Tin Man is horrifying. Because
Mm.
he becomes a tin man because he keeps chopping off his axe is cursed by one of the witches, and he keeps chopping off limbs. But there's a character in that, yeah, until he's nothing, right? And a tin man or
Gross.
a tinsmith keeps adding stuff, fixing him up. It's like, oh, he chops off
To
his
like protect
arm,
him.
right? And so he go, well, no, not to protect him, to replace. So Tin Man is
Oh,
cursed, chops off his arm, plunk. Okay, here's a new metal arm. He's like, Steve Austin, the $6 million man thing, until he
right, right.
chops off his head. Well, the story is this is really screwed up. So the story is this. So
You
um
say with a giggle.
well, it is because see, he comes across another dude called Captain Fighter, who's
hmm
also a tin man, but he has a
hmm
sword instead of an axe, and he had the same curse, and he was chopping himself off, and they were chopping himself up, and they come across, and they both were repaired by the same tinsmith. Well, the
hmm
tinsmith kept all the body parts. And so there's a picture in one of the versions of the book that show him with a jar of what says meat glue. and, and he's gluing all the parts. And so he creates a whole new person called Chapta, who ends up getting together with the Tin Man's ex-fiancee because she thought he was gone. And so he ends up getting married to the Tin Man's ex-fiancee, which would explain why he's missing a heart, right? I mean, that's
Yes.
isn't that
That's
nuts?
dark.
Oh
That's
my
like
God.
that's like there's some Dr. Frankenstein ties in there, but with
100%. I mean, there's a
yeah,
great picture. Well, I say great because it's me, but it
yeah,
has the tinsmith, and he's got his little jar, and he's got like an arm, and
meat
he's like,
glue.
yeah, let me, and this is kid style drawing, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Nuts, nuts.
That's what fascinates me is that way, way back in the day, the themes that were presented in children's stories
Yeah,
were very intense themes a lot of the time.
yeah.
And even I mean, I think about Moana even, and there's no jars of meat glue. There's nobody chopping their arms off,
That's what we should
but
have titled this. We
uh,
titled this
jars of meat glue.
Bars of Moot Glue and Other Children Tales. Yeah,
Yes, exactly. Other useful art mediums,
yeah,
But like in Moana, there's this theme of the ocean, the heart of the ocean, and this creature of the ocean has had her heart ripped out, but it's all presented in this very lovely, glowy green stone
yeah,
kind of way. But it's still
yeah,
the theme of like her heart has been ripped out by heartache,
yeah,
and that's a theme that you know kids aren't going to get. They're going to get in their own way, but then you become an adult and you're like, oh wait, I know what it feels like to feel like my heart's ripped out and there's no hope for it ever being
yeah,
back again.
yeah,
And I mean, it is bizarre to me how dark and heavy and real life so many kids stories are, even the lighthearted ones. Like I did a little question on my Facebook page asking people what some of their favorite children's books were and
okay,
that impacted them, and so many people said things like these bigger chapter books, Wizard of Oz, Black Beauty, Island of the Blue Dolphins. I don't know if you ever read that one. That would have been, a girl who's kind of alone on this island and has to survive, a lot of that.
right, right.
There was what's the one, Lord of the Flies?
Yeah.
Is that the one?
And is that a kid's book? I don't know. It's yes and no,
Yeah.
right? So yeah.
No, but
Yeah.
they were books that we all read as young
Yeah,
people in
yeah, yeah,
school.
yeah.
Like we
Yeah.
weren't yet adults. We weren't able to process those stories through like lots of life experience and all of that kind of
Yeah.
stuff. So
Yeah.
so it would have had a different impact. But then there were these really, really sweet answers. Like one of my friends said the book Harold and the Purple Crayon. which
Hmm.
which I hadn't heard of at the time. So I went to the library and checked it out. It is the sweetest, most there's no dark themes really in it, but it's basically this little boy who has a purple crayon, and he just creates whole worlds with this crayon for himself. And to me, it's like the it's like the simplest, sweetest way of letting kids know, like, I mean, even adults letting kids know, like, your imagination is powerful. You can create whole worlds with your ideas and what you want to do with it. So,
In that list, where did Little Prince ever? Did it anybody list Little Prince?
I don't know if they did, and I thought about that one. Also, James and the Giant Peach. Those are ones that I thought of, like, oh, I wonder if nobody's ever mentioned those. I'm
Well,
just
because
looking
like
here
Little
real quick.
Prince is such, I mean, because that's a great example of a book that,
Hmm.
yeah, it's a children's book, but it ain't no children's book. I mean, that's,
Right, right.
that's, I
It's
mean,
intense.
you read that as an adult, and it's like,
Yeah,
it makes perfect sense, what's going on there. So as a kid,
quite a few
maybe,
people mentioned Winnie the Pooh,
yeah.
Bubble Bubble by Mercer Mayer, another Mercer Mayer
Hmm.
book. Um, a friend of mine wrote Ulysses and the Cannibals of Sunset Drive. Have you ever heard of
Yeah,
that book?
I don't know that one.
I
Yeah.
haven't. I have a library list now of these books I want to check out. But a lot of them, Island of the Blue Dolphins, a lot of them were those kind of longer books. But yeah, like The Little Prince, James and the Giant Peach, those are ones that impacted me as a kid, but I didn't read
Yeah.
them until I was a little bit older,
Yeah, because
you know.
I know that with Little Prince, I don't think I read that till I was in college practically. I think I was one of
Yeah,
those
yeah.
things where you kept hearing about it. I know exactly how I came across it. I remember watching the film My Dinner with Andre, okay, which is
Hmm.
basically Wallace Shawn, who you would know because he plays what Vicini and Princess Bride.
Oh yeah.
Inconceivable, right? Okay.
I know him,
Of
yeah.
course, right.
I love him. Yeah.
It's and the whole movie is like him and another guy talking over dinner. Okay. And it's all
Mm.
it is. And it's, this back and forth between the two of them. And it's, very much an art house film, made in the late 70s, I think.
Hmm.
But one of the other character in that, Andre, talks extensively about the Little Prince. And so I watched that film and I go,
Hmm.
what? Okay, what is,
What's
whatever.
all the to do about it?
Right. And
Yeah.
so I read it and I go, this is, a pretty kick-ass little book, even
Yeah.
though it has,
Yeah.
even though it's a kiddie book, but yeah, it was a
Yeah.
pretty kick-ass book. And I
Yeah,
don't know.
it is.
It seems like a lot of the books, um, kids books I read that actually had a whole lot of text in it. It seems like the type of thing that I read later in life.
Yeah. Yeah.
I was looking through, like, starting to list some of the things that, like, for instance, J.R.R. Tolkien. Now, you would definitely not say Lord of the Rings is kids, but The Hobbit was written as a kids book, right?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
let's see what else.
I had the Hobbit in the version where it was a little like paperback book and it had a little 45 record in the back that
Oh, cool.
that
Yeah, yeah,
you'd
yeah.
play and you'd read along, and
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
it's time to turn the page when you hear the chimes ring like this, bling, and so I had a
Right,
whole
right,
collection of those. But
right,
I listened to the Hobbit, this little 12-page version or however many pages it was,
right,
over and
right.
over and over. It was such a good story.
Well, and I mean, yeah, because I mean, like, Roald Dahl. I mean, obviously Willy
Hmm.
Wonka, but I don't
Hmm.
know that I read the book until later because I was so
Hmm.
familiar with the movie. It's like, well, but
Yeah.
I know that I read them probably in high school or maybe middle school, maybe, but I think it was later. And same thing with like The Witches I just read.
Mm.
Roald Dahl's The Witches, about a little
Hmm.
kid who gets turned into, and there's a great line. I tell you what, this movie, Roald Dahl is just. I know there's some
He's amazing.
questionable aspects about him personally, to be sure, but
Yeah.
let's see, what was it? What were some of the quotes from that book? Let's see. Oh, I don't have any here. I thought I did, but there was one, about how, witches, they look like you and I, but they're just
Yeah.
these nasty little things, and their toes are all curled up and their hands are all claws, and but it's great.
Yeah. Yeah.
Such a fun read. But
Well, I'm noticing a theme, maybe between us, but maybe this applies to a lot of people, where there isn't necessarily children's books and then there were books as children that now as adults we would say this is mature content to be considering, as far as
Yeah.
like the
Yeah.
themes of death and dismemberment and meat glue and all of that kind of stuff. But it is interesting when you're talking about like the Wizard of Oz, for example, how the Wizard of Oz we're all familiar with, most of us are familiar with, is the movie.
Right.
Judy
Right.
Garland and all of that, and how we could say it's a politics, like movies politics, and I don't disagree with that. But I think even more so, it's a story of power. Like who has the power and why, who can who what powers are competing, who doesn't realize they have the power, and so they're subject to all of that kind of stuff. And what does power even look like?
Yeah.
I mean, there's the man behind the curtain doing all this big stuff, and turns out Judy has more, or Dorothy has more power in three little heel clicks than in all his big whatever. So it's like it begs the question of like, what does power even mean? What does it even look like? Who has it? Who's doing what with it? That kind of a thing. And so it's
Well,
like,
with Oz, I think it's, for instance, in Oz, all the characters, I mean, Dorothy's really in that first novel, because there's like, I
mm-hmm,
don't know, 30 different books that go,
mm-hmm,
on, but in that first novel, Dorothy is really the hero in that.
mm-hmm,
She's the one who
mm-hmm,
does everything. So I mean, you talk about strong female protagonist. But
mm-hmm,
every single character in Oz, who's looking for something, already has it.
mm-hmm.
They just
Yeah,
don't realize they
exactly.
have it.
Exactly. And they're acting in very powerful ways, thinking it's no big deal,
Right.
or being
Exactly.
uncertain about it, or
Yeah.
like, I don't know if this is the right thing to do, but it's all I know to do. Click, 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 and then boom, everything changes.
Well, and then the
So,
people who are in power, so let's say the Wicked Witch of the West,
mhm,
Oz, they're in power for shady reasons. Okay. So
exactly.
Wicked Witch of the West and her sister, the one who got smushed by a house
Yep.
in the books, they're powerful because of enslaving people. So Wicked Witch
Mhm.
of the East, the house smunched one, she the Munchkins are her slaves. In the
Mhm.
Wicked Witch of the West, the Winkies, the guards, and the
Mhm.
flying
Mhm.
monkeys,
Creepy
they're
monkeys.
right. Well, they're not bad guys in either case.
Mhm.
They're just
Mhm.
like the monkeys have. There's a magic hat that she uses, and she controls them, and
Mhm.
so they're enslavers. And of course the wizard is a dude who's, he's doing it through shenaniganery, if that's a
Mhm.
word. And so I mean,
It is
and
now.
so the big power is actually done through deception,
Yeah.
and oppression, whereas
Yeah.
the real, the real strength is internal, and it's just the
Yeah.
realization that you have it, right?
Yeah. And making the choice to use it,
Yeah.
with
Yeah.
purpose, and like, I'll bring along people, to that want to come along with me if they want, but I'm not going to, compel anyone
Yeah.
to be part of this. Yeah, I agree. So, question for you now: how why do you think for you that these stories have had such an impact, to the extent, and when I say these stories, that can be whichever ones come to your mind, to the extent that they're such, um in like profound themes in your artwork?
Well, first off, I think for me personally, it has to do with the fact that, um, number one, I've always been very much into the fantastical.
Hmm.
So, ever since, I was a wee little lad, ever since my dad read me, from the book
Dracula.
Dracula, I mean, I've always been into, the fantastical, the bizarre, the
Hmm.
strange, definitely
Hmm.
not like Little House on the Prairie type stuff. It always
Hmm.
had to be
Hmm.
more over the top and strange and weird. And
Almost
so,
otherworldly in a way.
yeah, absolutely. And a part of that, I think, in my case, was because I was very, very shy as a child. And
Mm,
so a
that's so
lot,
hard to imagine.
Well, in some degree,
I mean, I believe you. I
no,
believe
and to
you.
some degree, it's still true. It's just, it's
Mhm.
like I'm not shying in situations where I feel I have a level of control over.
Yeah.
But but yeah, I mean, as a kid, and a lot of it was because I moved a fair amount, and you sort of like some people
Yeah.
compensate in different ways, right? Some people like I'm
Yeah.
really outgoing, and I was more like, But
Hmm.
the thing is that I think that I spent a lot of time drawing and doing stuff alone,
Hmm.
and so that was where the fantastical. So, I would have adventures, you know, in my own little world,
In
my
your
own
own way.
little yeah, my own little drawing world, and so that I think had a lot to do with how why I got more and more fantastical because
Hmm.
I always found the world rather mundane. And so it
Hmm.
was a way of making it sort of like, okay, so how can I make this world less mundane? It's sort of
Yeah.
like, of like doing dishes and doing chores and going to school and
Yeah.
How do you
Yeah.
how do you do that?
Boring.
Right.
Yeah.
How do you do that? And it's sort of like, well, fantastical stories, fantastical art. I mean, films, TV, but it had to be something that sort of made me feel like, yeah, I don't feel exactly at home here,
Hmm.
but I feel at home
Hmm.
here.
Hmm.
And so
Hmm.
um and that was my that was the way I compensated, I think.
Yeah. And so it's still showing up in your work.
Well, yeah, because I mean, most of my themes are in some ways, I mean, they're I mean, my work has a a darker element, but it's really not much darker than when I was a kid. I mean, it
Yeah.
was sort of like I was doing excuse me. I remember I told you the story about my mom's first Christmas present. It was that I remember
Which
giving.
one? Yeah.
Um, it was my preschool teacher wasn't I don't know. I'm sure it wasn't my first one, but was my mom's best friend.
Hmm.
And I came over to her house and she gave me an apron, a white apron,
Oh
and she gave me a
yeah.
bunch of
Yeah.
markers, right? It said Merry
That was
Christmas,
my first
Mom, and
thought
then I
too. Yeah.
drew on it. And it was like, and I was whatever age you are, preschool. And I
Yeah.
drew werewolves and vampires and bats
Right.
and things like that. And my paintings in preschool, finger painting were like werewolves and stuff. That
Yeah.
was
Yeah.
that was my interest. I mean, that
Yeah.
was, and they're like, "Oh, what's wrong with him?" But
This kid. Yeah.
right, but that was,
This kid is
that was me.
disturbed.
Right. So,
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, I still like werewolves and monsters and things. Um, so my interests both in film and stories and in um just childhood interests are pretty much the same. I just
Yeah.
perhaps am I doing it more maturely now? I don't know. I mean, I'm
No.
these days I worry less about like, is this really art? I don't, that whole thing of is this art? I just make stuff because I want to make it now. I'm
Yeah.
sort of
Yeah.
those days are sort of like I'm not going to even I'm tired of wrestling those stupid questions because
Yeah.
I think a true artist is just going to make,
Yeah.
and they're going to just, a fake
They're
artist
too
is
busy
somebody.
creating to be hung up on the question.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
if it's worthwhile, then okay, perhaps history will deem it so. Maybe
Yeah.
yes, maybe no, if that even matters. So,
Yeah.
but
Well, one of the things that I love about your work, and I've told you this before, and on chats that we've had before, is you say your work has kind of a dark theme, and I agree, but it's also really fun. Like your characters are always these, like I can't not kind of smile when I see some of what you've created because you bring this very, I don't want to say childlike um creativity to it, but this playfulness to it. It's like, oh, I'm going to make this creature, but I'm going to make his head 4 times bigger than his body, or so
right,
there's something,
right,
there's always something in it that, the marionette vibe that some of your pieces have, or things that move, or eyes that go back and forth. There's something kind of fun and interactive about it, and I love that because I think one of the I think people who want to avoid dark things in their life for whatever reason, there could be a bazillion reasons, will assume that, or could assume that any of those Brothers Grimm's tales or anything that feels like that is to be avoided. because it's like, oh no, I'm just happy and sunshine, and like, and I like things lighthearted and fun, and but at the same time, the reason I am drawn to, or let's see, how do I say this? The reason I value and appreciate lightheartedness and all the different ways that it can show up in life is because of my understanding of the depths and the darkness that can also exist in life.
Hmm.
Like this isn't a story about my life story, but like you could look at my life as a kid and go, dang, there's some dark themes there, and
Yeah.
pretending to not like look at them or avoiding looking at those dark themes isn't going to make my life happy and light, kind of a
Right.
thing. it's
Yeah.
by it's by like looking at them and saying, like gleaning from them in some way, learning from them, or at least realizing that like dark doesn't mean bad. Dark is just like,
Well,
if the human experience is vast, it's just one aspect of the human experience.
Well, my reasoning for working in the dark, so to say,
Mm-hmm.
this also stems from childhood stuff. It's because
Mm-hmm.
it was my way of battling monsters. Monsters
Mm-hmm.
are less scary when when you have control over them. And how
Yeah.
do you have control over them? You have control over them in your art, right? I can
Yeah.
control
Yeah.
any adversity that faces me. Now, many of the adverse things that I deal with um, are metaphoric.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm making this, but the reason I'm making that is maybe that represents something else that's much darker that I'm trying to
Yeah.
face off, right? And that's
Yeah.
that's sort of been my process throughout. Is like you use these things, they become less scary. Um,
Mm-hmm.
as best you can. I mean, and I'm not saying I'm not every artist. Some
Yeah.
people I am embracing my tragedy, I'm embracing my whatever,
Yeah.
and but is it working through it? Maybe yes, maybe no, but that's
Yeah.
everybody's got a different thing that their art is doing. But for me, it's I'm doing it exactly I'm doing the exact same stuff I was as a little kid. I mean, exact
Mm-hmm.
same stuff. I'm just,
Mm-hmm.
making it differently, but themes are
Yeah.
still there. And in some ways,
Yeah.
I think the other side to it, Stephanie, is that I think that being an adult kind of sucks. I mean, it's sort of like, it's not as fun as being a kid. I mean, it's like there's this, it's sort of like there's a freedom that you have as a kid, you know, and and granted, there's, I'm not saying childhood is not without tragedy, but at the same time, and fears to be sure, but at the same time, adulting kind of sucks. The
Yes.
blah of, like, it's, we just finished, tax season, right?
uh
April, whatever, right?
I
Okay,
know.
who likes doing that? I want to go back
I
to the days when I
just
didn't have to do that.
I was just taking some laundry over to get washed this morning, over to the laundry room, and I remember thinking, I just did this.
Right,
you know,
exactly. Yeah.
I just did
Yeah.
this. And like there was a moment a couple of months ago probably where I was like trying to figure out what to, our shopping list, because the shopping list is determined by what you want to eat that week. And then you got to figure out recipe, all this kind of stuff. And I just looked at Vince and I was just like, we have to do this for the rest of our lives. I have to figure out a
Yeah, no, as
shopping
a
list
kid, it's
for
it's
the
for the
rest of my
afternoon.
life.
You only have to worry about the
Yeah,
afternoon. School's out,
exactly.
woo, and that
Yeah.
afternoon lasts
And you're free.
forever. I mean, that's the
Yeah.
longest afternoon you'll ever have I mean,
Yep.
that afternoon seemed like a whole week feels like now.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. I know. And we're like, oh no, I only have the afternoon to,
Yeah.
do all this adult stuff. Yeah. Well, there's so much value. I mean, I think even as adults, and I mean, you're an embodiment of this in your art of, I don't want to say getting lost in a good story, but reconnecting with a good story in whatever way, and kind of like life isn't all just laundry and shopping lists. There's this whole realm of imagination that's available to us even in our 40s and 50s and
Could you
60s. And
imagine doing art like, oh, my artwork is about doing laundry? I'll bet you
there
there's
are
somewhere in the world
there are
somebody is
people
who
there
makes
are
laundry art.
people
right?
Yeah, it's probably performative, interpretive dance,
Yeah,
something,
but it's
you
like, yes,
know.
I'm studying, I'm really expressing laundry, oh my
I'm majoring in the
God.
studies of domestic duties. Yeah, I know, all that kind of stuff. Yeah. So you tell me about what you have going on right now with this
What's going
theme.
on? Well, this theme, I actually am in the process of one of the reasons that I'm so familiar with Wizard of Oz right now is because I've been immersed in it because I'm doing an online version of my Wizard of Oz class, which I taught a number of years back in New Orleans. And so I'm doing it's pretty fun, just making all the different characters, as many characters as I can for the class. But
Yeah.
I've been busy making scarecrows and tin men and wizards and witches and things like that. So that's been what I've been has been consuming me the last number of weeks is
Do you
filming.
have any of the creatures within arm's reach? I didn't
I
prep
don't.
you.
I do not. I
Okay.
should have thought. I
That's
should have. I
fine.
should. Yes, I should have thought. But
Maybe
no, I do not
maybe
have.
we can show some pictures in post editing or something. We
There
can
you go.
show some
There
close
you
up.
go.
So
But
that's
yeah,
a
so
class that's coming up.
yeah, that's coming up, and the usual stuff. Heading out to Lincoln City to teach in Oregon in I guess, another week or two. I'll be there, and of
So soon.
course, then a few things in the summer, and then off to Oaxaca again for Day of the Dead, as usual. So just
In the fall.
in the fall, yeah, October.
Yeah.
So yeah,
So so today we're recording this. It's April 18th. So the class is open for registration, but it doesn't start yet. But if people are watching the
yeah, it starts
replay,
in
it's going to
June.
be in your library.
Yeah, it starts in June. Early bird discount ends May 1st, so save
Okay.
a nice chunk of change by May 1st. Work at your own pace. There are some live components as well, live Q&As, and then crit for those people who want to do that at the end. So yeah,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
but
You're probably my favorite. I haven't sat in on a lot of art critiques because gross, but I've sat in on a few of your art critiques and observed them, and yours are so fun because you don't just like, I don't know. I've already talked about this too. Like you literally give people good information and celebrate the work they've done and give them
well,
good
a
feedback.
lot of that stems from I had a friend who was a gallery director.
Mm-hmm.
And and granted, there was some work that they carried in this particular gallery that it was a gallery that I was represented in that I was like, yeah, I don't really like this. And I remember talking to him as
Mm-hmm.
like, and I know where he came from.
Mm-hmm.
He was an artist. But this was his job with a capital J. And I said, well, I know the type of stuff you like. How do you sell? Because that's really what his job was, is try and sell this
Mm-hmm.
work, right?
Mm-hmm.
He really was a sale associate. And so, how do you sell work that you don't, that isn't really your cup of tea? And he's like, look,
Yeah.
he's like, there's always something in any piece of
Mm-hmm.
art that is of value. And I
Mm-hmm.
remember him saying that. And it's like, of course that's true. Of course that's true.
Yeah.
And it
Yeah.
may not as a whole be something that I want to hang in my house, but the job I always figure I have, just to be respectful to other people, whatever they do, whatever art form,
Yeah.
whether it's in a gallery or whether it's in a class, to be respectful. My job is to actually try and figure out, um, okay, what is of value here, and why
Mm-hmm.
why is it important to that person, and what things can we all learn from that? And that's my
Yeah.
view of
Yeah.
the critique, because there's always something you can learn from somebody else's art.
Yeah.
Even if it's something you don't really care about, even if it's something
Mm-hmm.
you wouldn't really care about. I mean something you wouldn't hang in your house necessarily.
Yeah.
But what can I learn from this?
Yeah.
What can this person teach me? And
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
true, I think, with almost anything practically.
I agree. And I think that there are a lot of people who are so like critique avoidant
Hmm.
that they miss out on opportunities to make their work better.
Yeah.
And they're, they spend a lot of time frustrated that they're not growing or evolving, and it's like, well, maybe you need a good critique every once in a while from somebody who
And
has
there
that
and I
perspective that you
understand,
have.
I understand the whole critique thing. I mean,
Yeah.
because I went to
It's
art
growth.
school. I know what it's about. I mean, it's
Yeah.
about douchey instructors who
Yeah.
have a chip on their shoulder, who
Yeah.
are, you know, really there to make people feel inferior and them to feel superior. And I get it. I know tons of people who went through that. And I don't know. I just don't believe in that. I don't believe that's an effective way to grow, or teach,
Absolutely.
So
Absolutely. Absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah. Well, awesome. This has been a fun conversation
It
exploring
has
the
been fun.
world of children's books and stories we read as kids.
And other things.
Yeah. We just bought my granddaughter's 8 and she's smart as a whip, but cannot be bothered to sit and read for very long. She would rather be out like climbing trees and all that, which is just fine with me.
Yeah,
She'll
kid
she'll
stuff.
she'll pick it up. But we were like, well, if we wanted to encourage her to enjoy reading as part of her stuff, like what would we get? So we went to the library or to the bookstore and we're looking and looking and looking. And Vince was like, we got to get her Dick and Jane. So he found this cool. He loved Dick and Jane when he was a kid because it was easy, I think, and then he could go play. So we got her a vintage Dick and Jane, and then there were these Frog and Toad books that I loved as a kid in the 70s that were, Frog and Toad were friends and they had all these like adventures and misadventures together. But what I was looking for were what I had loved, which was Encyclopedia Brown, which I was kind of chatting with you a little bit about it. It was a story of a kid whose nickname was Encyclopedia, but it was like a kid's version of Sherlock Holmes, right?
Mm-hmm.
But there was also this choose your own adventure kind of element to it. And I thought, well, maybe she'll love a choose your own adventure thing. But it was just kind of fun, like diving back into that world of what did I like reading when I was a kid. And so to then have this conversation with you and to kind of explore that, it made me actually climb up in my attic and dig out some of my books that I've saved all these years to share with my grandkids. So yeah, it's a fun realm to explore and to revisit even as an adult, and to ask yourself, like, what was it about this book that really struck me, and rediscovering themes that maybe you didn't really pick up on as a kid.
I think people would be surprised, like if they really did just looking back. I think they'd be surprised of some of the things that are consistent and connections that they might make. So wait a second, I'm seeing some consistency here. So
yeah, awesome.
Cool. All right, did we cover all the bases?
I mean, us, we could talk all day.
I know, it's true.
We've covered 4 bases. We could find more if we wanted
That's
to.
That's right. But I think we've got at least 4. All right, good.
Yeah.
All right, kids. Well, thanks for listening. This has been Michael DeMeng and
Stephanie Lee, and we will have info. I'm going to have info in the description where you can check out Michael and his work and his classes. That's a whole world. It's a whole fun world to explore what he's creating and offering. So fun.
And
to chat
vice
with you,
versa
friend.
to my buddy Stephanie.
Why, thank you. All right. Have a good day, buddy. Talk to you later.
You too. Ciao, ciao, ciao.